My name is Andrew Doran. I'm the president of In Defense of Christians, and welcome again this evening. It's my honor now to introduce our first speaker. Katrina Lantos-Swett is the president of the Lantos Foundation. She is, of course, the daughter of the very famous Tom Lantos, who was the only Holocaust survivor to serve in the U.S. Congress. And I think I've told you the story. I remember as a young child, my mother watching television saying what a hero he was as a very young man when he was in Congress. And Katrina has friends all over the world, and I know this because I've run into them. I've had them call me, and when I was in public service at the State Department, would get phone calls. And I don't think even among your enemies you could find a person who could say a bad word about Katrina. The work that you've done over the years is an inspiration to everyone. You've been a great friend of this work going back many, many years. And I would say that in a time such as this, of intense partisanship, it's wonderful to have someone who need not remind us through words to rise above partisanship for causes, but does so by example. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce Katrina Lantos-Swett.
Well, thank you for that very, very gracious introduction, and I'm so glad that I can be here with all of you tonight. I'm not ordinarily in Washington, D.C. during just an ordinary week because my offices and my home are in New Hampshire, but this week I happened to be here. I was so honored to be asked to join you, and I'm really glad that we can be here together. This is a group, IDC, that I have huge admiration for, and at this time of year in particular, the Christmas season, we cannot help but think about the sort of foundation of your mission, which is helping and rescuing the communities of Christians in the very part of the world where Christianity began. It's such a really profound mission, one that pertains not only to our shared cultural history, and the importance that these ancient communities be defended and not disappear from their place of their birth, but also as it relates to the broader issue of defending and protecting the freedom of religion and conscience and belief for all people everywhere. So I'm really very excited to be here, and I was thinking about sort of what I might share with you, and I don't want to take too long, but a couple of thoughts were in my mind, and so I'll just share those briefly because I think they may have some relevance to the ideals that bring you here together. Some years ago, I was in Germany for a conference, an OSCE conference, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe conference, that was examining the state of anti-Semitism in Europe. And as was just mentioned, I'm the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And so the conference was very interesting, but quite frankly also kind of depressing because the bottom line takeaway was that the state of anti-Semitism was not good. It was rising, surging, and in the same continent where 6 million had been killed, once again, there was this resurgence of this terrible hatred. And it was during a break in this conference that I sort of thought, okay, I'm going to just take a little tour of the city because I kind of needed to clear my mind. And while on the tour of the city, I learned something very interesting. So the tour guide talked about, I want to get my dates right, so that's why I'm going to put my glasses on here. So this was in Berlin. And the tour guide talked about the fact that in 1685, the Edict of Nantes had been revoked, and that this had resulted in a huge immigration of Huguenots from France to Germany. Now, those of you who are better historians than I will recall that the Edict of Nantes, which had been initially adopted in the late 1500s, had basically granted to the Calvinist Huguenots certain basic rights in France, which was an overwhelmingly Catholic country. And although these were limited rights, you could argue that this was sort of an early advancement of the idea of freedom of conscience and religion. And so the repeal of this was a tremendous step backwards. You know, the prevailing idea at that time was well summed up in the Latin phrase, cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. And the idea was that people needed to adopt the faith of whoever was the ruler, the monarch of a particular realm. And so the repeal of this step forward in the direction of religious freedom was a very troubling development. But the upshot of it was that there was this significant outmigration from France to Germany, to Berlin. And what the tour guide said was that those immigrants ended up building many of the key industries in that nascent community. And I thought to myself how interesting it is, because isn't that so often the case, that when people are driven out of a community? I had the opportunity to chat with some new Americans who came here from Afghanistan. It's the country that drives them out that loses that precious, precious blessing of having their talent and their skills there in the community, and the place that they go to ends up benefiting. And it was just a reminder to me that when we fail to protect and defend the fundamental conscience rights of people, not only are we failing in our duty as it relates to protecting a basic human right, but the countries that allow that to happen are suffering the loss of some of the important treasures of their own community. The second thought that was going through my head is a much more personal one. Again, as mentioned, my dad was a Holocaust survivor, the only one ever elected to the United States Congress. And he never talked much about the terrible experiences he suffered as a boy in Hungary during those years. That's where he and my mother were born. But one very powerful story came to us through one of his best friends. So in March of 1944, Hungary was occupied by the Germans. Hungary had been an ally of Germany, but Germany was beginning to suspect that it was a wavering ally, and so decided to occupy the country to prevent it from changing sides and going over to the side of the Allies. And that occupation, it began on March 19th, 1944, really began the true nightmare for the Jews of Hungary, including my family. And my father, who was a young teenager at the time, like many, many thousands of other young Jewish boys, was rounded up and sent to a slave labor camp outside of Budapest, where he was conscripted into really brutal labor under terrible conditions. And as I say, he didn't ever really like to talk about his memories from those times. But this one story that was shared with us has had always a great impact on me. The commander, if you will, of the barracks that my father was in decided, I suppose, to burnish somehow his reputation or his credentials, that he was going to require all the Jewish boys in his barracks to forcibly convert to Christianity. Now these kids were terrified, they were helpless, they were completely, really at his mercy. And so they all agreed to do so, all except two, my father and his friend. He subsequently became a surgeon, Dr. Nori Kerenyi. And they were very, very badly beaten for their refusal to comply with this demand. And what is so interesting to me about this story is my father was not, at that time in his life, a particularly religious young teenager. He did have a belief in God, and over time, no doubt partly as a result of the terrible experiences of his life, that mindset evolved into a more skeptical agnosticism. But I don't believe it was particularly my father's personal religiosity or sense of being grounded in his Jewish faith that made him resist this forced conversion. But rather, it was something in that young boy's character that recognized that if he allowed his integrity to be trampled upon in this way, if he allowed something as fundamental as a decision about what to believe to be forced upon him, and if he acquiesced in that he would at some level be giving away a very important part of his character and his soul. And he was unwilling to do that. And I like to think that the quality of character that he had that made him eventually such a valiant defender of the rights of all people. He went on in Congress to found the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, and he really became the U.S. Congress's most outspoken and most passionate defender of human rights. And I like to think that those qualities of character began at that difficult and dark moment, that trial of character, when he decided he valued the integrity of his own conscience rights even more than he valued his safety and security. So I come to you today as somebody who now for a number of years has worked in this field of defending the conscience rights and the religious freedom rights of people in every corner of the world. I had the great privilege of serving as chair and vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And over the last few years, I've had the really very exciting opportunity alongside former Ambassador Sam Brownback of co-chairing the International Religious Freedom Summit. And we're so grateful to have IDC as one of our really important partners in that endeavor. And I may be biased, but I think those of us who work in this space, and I'm sure you gentlemen agree, really are the luckiest people in the world because we get to meet and make common cause with people of high ideals and deep commitments, and people who look beyond their own lives and their own path and step out of their comfort zone to defend and protect those who need someone to stand up for them, who find themselves under fire, in danger, persecuted and oppressed because of their convictions and beliefs. And so it is a wonderful privilege, and you really do get to work with and get to know the most extraordinary people in the world. So I want to thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I'm so grateful to those of you who are supporting this wonderful organization. Angels are taking notes and keeping record, and whether you see rewards in this life, it's really quite unimportant, because where it counts, your commitment, your devotion, your generosity, and your service is duly noted. And so I thank you, and I salute you, and thank you for inviting me to be with you today.